Good morning to everyone. My name is John Mayo. I am the Executive Director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host today. On behalf of the center, let me welcome you here today, both to a new venue and to what I think promises to be a terrific morning of discussion. The venue is one that we at Georgetown have just opened. It is referred to sort of colloquially as Georgetown Downtown. I hope it will be a lovely venue for many events for the center. It offers easy metro access to the Law Center, to Capitol Hill, and to many of the offices that you occupy here in downtown Washington. We found over the years that bringing events to you is easier than getting you to the Georgetown campus. I'd love it if you'd come out and visit us, but we certainly understand that this is easier for everybody. So thank you very much for being part of this venue. Because we are just getting started, naturally, you should let us know if there's anything that we can do to make your life more palatable while you're here. So please, feedback is more than welcome. In terms of today's event, the logistics are that we'll have a panel that will be moderated by our very own Carolyn Brennan, who is a Georgetown Industry and Innovation Fellow. I'll let Carolyn do the introductions for the wonderful panelists that we have teed up under the title, A Regulator's Dilemma, Policy in an Age of Disruption. It's part of a larger series that we refer to as the Evolution of Regulation and Innovation project that we've kicked off at the center. That will be an ongoing discussion. We'll have a number of events under this umbrella, and I think it opens, hopefully, a new set of discussions about, as the title says, the evolution of regulation and innovation and how to do those things smartly. Before we turn to the panel, we are very, very fortunate to have as our keynote to offer some reflections, Professor Tim Brennan. Tim is, as you all know, I think, the chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. This is an important economic policy advisory role that has a distinguished lineage, and Tim is part of that lineage. But Tim is not a stranger to the economic policy process. He has served in senior advisory capacities for the White House at the Council of Economic Advisors, for the Canadian government at the Antitrust Division. He is an accomplished scholar and a regular contributor in a wide variety of areas. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate over the years is how wide-ranging Tim's expertise is. Tim writes in telecommunications, law and economics, environmental economics, electricity policy, and a number of other areas, and is a real resource to policymakers in this town and to academics as well. So we're delighted to have Tim here to offer some reflections in his role as the chief economist of the FCC. I have to tell you before I turn it over to Tim that and you'll excuse, I hope, the personal digression, is that that Tim and I both have enough gray hair that we've been going to conferences together for about 25 years. And I know all of you go to conferences as well. And aside from the various sessions that you go to, there's always a moment at your conferences when you have to make a more or less spontaneous decision at the cocktail hour of who to talk to, or at dinner of who you're going to sit next to. Well, I can tell you that in terms of my praise for Tim Brennan, for 25 years, I've been seeking Tim out at cocktail hours and for dinner. The knowledge that I get from Tim, the insights I get from Tim, at both those sort of casual settings have been invaluable. So let me just say that aside from Tim's professional accolades, let me recommend that if you ever are at a conference with Tim, have the opportunity to have a cold drink with him, or dinner, please do seek to sit next to Tim. So please help me welcome Tim Brennan.
Thanks, John. Those were especially kind remarks because I'm almost never buying. And will also say that I wish I had more gray hair than I do. Another thing about introduction, I just sort of noticed I was looking at the conference materials, is that there's bios in there for everybody but me. And you people may not realize this, but there's a little notice provision in the Open Internet NPRM, which allows FCC staff to go into the witness protection program. And I've availed myself of the opportunity, apparently. Some of the economists there and I, had a bit of a chuckle. I really appreciate what John said, but one of the things that differentiates economists from non-economists in Washington is that non-economists think economists run everything, and economists know that that it's a miracle if they have anything to do at all with what happens any place. That's not an FCC specific remark at all. There's a kind of, hey, people think you're important, ha ha ha. But anyhow, we'll talk a little more about that. I have to give the disclaimer that, and I'll read it to make sure I get it right. The opinions expressed here are those of me alone and do not necessarily represent the positions of the Federal Communications or the U.S. government. And I can guarantee you that will be true, in part because I'm not going to talk about open matters, which is basically almost anything these days people would be really interested in. So I'm not going to give you my take on the economics of net neutrality particularly, or how people are thinking about actual or prospective mergers and that sort of stuff. And there are also a lot of other things going on which I happen not to know much about, which I know are a matter of great interest, like the E-rate rural broadband experiments or subsidies out there and that sort of stuff. There is one aside I'll mention about economics at the FCC, which surprised me when I got there. I'm not sure how people in this audience would be. But one of the things I was very surprised to find out was that, one of the things John mentioned is one of the things that places I work is a place called Resources for the Future, which is an environmental energy resource place. And there people spend a lot of time thinking about the value of environmental protection, and a big issue in that is trying to measure how much mortality risk reductions are worth, this whole value statistical life thing. And not long after I got to the FCC, somebody sent me something which had a value statistical life number in it. I had no idea the FCC did that, but in fact, when you do a cost-benefit analysis for 911 improvements, that goes into it. I mean, it's very hard to get the data and all that sort of thing, but I was just really surprised to see it at all. So the breadth of what economists do there is actually I knew it was broad, but it turned out to be even broader than I thought. Let me say something a little about the chief economist's position, because a lot of people I know thinking about at least similar positions in Washington may have a different expectation about what it might be than what it is. It's not like those that my colleagues had at the Antitrust Division Federal Trade Commission. Primarily, it's because there is not an economics bureau at the FCC. The economists are spread out in about 5 different sections, one of which provides general policy advice, and the others are sort of more specific: media, wireless, wireline, international. So it's quite spread out. So in a way, I'm kind of there as sort of an advisor within the Office of Strategic Planning. I'm not, nobody reports to me. Sometimes people even there will ask me things like, who's available to work on such and such, and I go, why are you asking me? I don't know, who's doing what. I mean, you kind of pick it up after a while a little bit, but still, it's not that kind of a central focus thing. In a lot of ways, it's like being an invited academic advisor for a year, and these things are designed for visiting academics to come for a year or two. I'll be there through this calendar year. However, at least for me, it's actually been pretty good. I can't say that I go in to talk to the chairman with great regularity. However, I do get a chance to talk to people who do have the chairman's ear with great regularity, in the sense that they will take the time to listen to what I have to say, enough time for them to understand it, and then they can bring it up as suits the situation. And as far as I'm personally concerned, that's the best that I could ask for. I mean, I don't, it's in a lot of ways, doing that, but then not having an office that's right next to all of the hubbub that goes on up there is actually, at least for me, sort of preferable. So what I want to do, because I don't really want to get into too much on specifics, is kind of bring some things which may or may not come up. I don't know that they really have come up very much specifically, but because I think it's safe to say that things like innovation and disruption are typically viewed as arguments for why policy or regulation or antitrust should be looser, less stringent, less activist, more caution with that sort of thing. I just want to throw out some ideas on the other side of that, mostly because that's my nature. And so I've got a couple of papers on some of these things that sort of predate my time at the commission. But I want to talk about sort of basically 3 points and then finish up with a little bit on things I've learned about antitrust working at the FCC and why it may be a little different there than at some other places. The first point is that disruption may not lead to a reduction in market power on the supply side of something. And the best example of that to me is the most disruptive innovation that what would be number one on my list in human history would be electricity. Electricity, much of that, is a monopoly, still regulated. The distribution and wire side of these things are still natural monopolies, pretty much. Still regulated. A lot of places have opened the generation markets to competition, which I think is a good thing, by and large, with some slight fingers crossed. But I think it's a good thing. But that probably pretty much wiped out a competitive industry, I assume, in candles and other sorts of ways of getting lighting and things like that, gas lamps, whatever. So you have a disruptive technology, and now you've got a monopoly you didn't have. And you've got regulation around that you didn't have. And one can probably think of other examples like that. So first point, simple one, it's not the case that innovation necessarily makes markets more competitive. The second one is maybe a little less obvious, is that it doesn't necessarily reduce the case for regulation on the demand side either. When you think about a disruptive innovation, you think about it as shrinking the demand for something. I'll take an example, perhaps to be on the safe side, perhaps because I'd given it some thought in the last year or two, which would be email and the Postal Service. Okay. It's, there's data after data after data, research shows something that everybody sort of pretty much knows, is that email has taken a huge chunk out of the letters business. It's been a complement to parcels, but it's been a huge chunk out of the letters business. Does that mean that one could walk away necessarily from postal regulation? And the answer is, you got to be careful. It's certainly the case that reducing demand for something reduces the amount of money that a regulated firm can get. And if your people care about that, then I suppose that it does reduce the impetus or the justification for regulation. On the other hand, one could imagine a situation where the disruptive technology, the new innovation comes in, and the people it sucks out of the market are the people with high elasticity of demand and relatively low willingness to pay for the service. And it's possible that what you have left is a small number of people with very inelastic demand and perhaps a very high willingness to pay. And it's not that hard to construct models or scenarios where the profit maximizing price for the incumbent actually goes up following the disruption, because they've got no reason to hold the price down in order to keep these low willingness to pay customers, because they're gone. All they have left are the sort of the people who are never going at all. And just to take an example of this, my dad, who's 88, the chance that he is ever going to substitute email for postal mail is 0. You know, absolute guarantee. You know, I could stand in front of him with a computer, it doesn't matter. And he actually worked in IT for a living, but still, it doesn't matter. He's not going there. So if people like my dad are the ones who are left after email takes over the business, it's possible that absent regulation, you've got a small number of particularly vulnerable people to whom you could raise the price. So it isn't necessarily the case that when you have a disruptive technology, and one can think of telecom examples of this, that in and of itself that necessarily means that, well, gee, they can't charge us higher prices they used to. And therefore, gee, maybe we shouldn't be bothering to regulate this. Now, it is the case that because the firms can't make as much money when there's not as much demand, they may have less money sitting around after they've covered their fixed costs, and so the difference between the regulated price and the monopoly price may shrink. That's possible too. And by the way, it's by no means necessarily the case that disruptive innovation is going to cause the incumbent's price to rise. The normal thing you would expect could also happen. It could be that it would fall as well. So, but the point is that there's a lot of it depends out there that you don't always have. And so just kind of having an automatic attitude toward that is something just kind of be cautious. Just wait a second on that. And here's a kind of an antitrust way to look at it, just taking an example, is that a different example would be presumably cars are a disruptive technology for bicycles, if one looks long enough. I assume that had cars never been invented, more people would ride bicycles now than they do because we have cars. Does that mean that if all the bicycle companies merged to create one bicycle monopoly, that they would have as a defense, well, gee, there are cars? Well, no, I don't think so. One would think that just because they took away business doesn't mean they're in the relevant market. The distinction that I and others have made on this is the distinction between what we call growth substitutes and marginal substitutes. A growth substitute is something that takes demand away. A marginal substitute is something where how much demand it takes away depends a lot on relative prices. And you can be a growth substitute without a marginal substitute. Email can take away from postal, or to tread into telecom lately, wireless can take away from wireline voice. But that switch may have very little to do with relative prices. So it's just, again, just something to be careful about to keep in mind. The last main point on disruptive innovation, please keep an eye on time, by the way. The one on innovation is there's a lot of, it's more on the antitrust side. But even at the FTC, one thinks about antitrust things, so that's sort of my main background, but I haven't, but still think about stuff like that, let's just say from time to time, not being specific. You say, there's a very common view out there that because that innovation in some sense weakens the case for antitrust enforcement. There's a variety of arguments for this. Say, the main driver of the economy is succeeding innovation. It's a sort of Schumpeterian view that, the dynamic benefits of all this trump, way overwhelm any static benefits you might get from trying to make a market act more competitively. And another sort of view is that monopolies may be better at internalizing the benefits from innovation, and perhaps may be better able to fund it as well. Now, there are views on the other side. Just to focus on one is that there's a widely held view, and perhaps correct in many cases, that competition stimulates innovation because maybe the market is bigger, there's more opportunity to gain from innovation, maybe people are putting more pressure on each other, arguments along those lines. I don't want to say that there is no tension at all. I'm perfectly willing to grant that there is a tension between regulation and antitrust, things to try to make markets more efficient in a kind of static sense, and innovation activity and policies that try to, make markets more, or make economies grow more in a dynamic way. I'm perfectly willing to accept that there's a tension there. But I'm not sure that that answers all the questions. Let me talk about that maybe mention just a few things on those lines. The first is that, some people say, well, we don't have to worry about these mergers. I'm not talking about FCC mergers, that's why mergers in general in a lot of areas, because, innovation is going to come along, whatever, and just sort of trump what's going on. And the problem there is that, well, the prospect of innovation may mean that firms that aren't competitors now might be. And in that case, maybe you have to worry about something you wouldn't have to worry about but for the prospect of innovation. Let me give an example. Let's assume for the moment, I realize this is a dicey assumption, that the government's antitrust case against Microsoft was a valid case. A lot of people, I could go on about that. I'm not going to do that here, but let's assume that that's the case. Suppose that in 1994, Microsoft, maybe instead of developing Internet Explorer, bought Netscape. What would we have done? Vertical merger. Things are separate markets, probably double marginalization benefits. You'd have to let it go. Well, 4 or 5 years later, there's the antitrust case of the century, I guess, but for US v. AT&T or whatever, or but for anything else, comes along basically saying that Microsoft views Netscape as some kind of competitive threat and is going to try to impede it. Should one say, okay, we're going to take those kinds of arguments into account, those innovation-based ones, and say we're going to bring those into mergers. If you do, maybe some mergers that might be okay, all of a sudden get into a problematic on kind of potential entry grounds. But I think there's a stronger argument about this, which involves policy tools. Yes, there's a tension, but if we want to promote dynamic efficiency, we've got lots of arrows in the policy quiver to do that. R&D subsidies, investment tax credits, IP, intellectual property policy generally, appropriately fine-tuned and that kind of thing. Obviously, people argue about a lot of those things at the margins. But the point is, we have all those things out there. The only things we have to make markets more competitive, essentially is antitrust. And say, we're going to weaken antitrust or try to use that as an innovation promotion tool. Say, well, you're taking away the one thing about, that could do something about static stuff, so now you've got nothing left. In the meantime, you've got these other ways to promote innovation that are out there. And not only are they out there, they're more general. A problem with using antitrust and with discretionary antitrust prosecution on innovation grounds is that it's case specific. If we think, gee, it'd be okay if these people merged, these people colluded or whatever because they're going to promote innovation. Well, that only shows up in a particular case that happens to arrive on the doorstep of the antitrust division of the FTC for other reasons. If we think that, say, collusion is good for innovation, I suppose some people probably would repeal the Sherman Act for that, but maybe say, even if you don't want to collude, we're going to force you to collude. Because we think innovation is more important than the benefits we're getting from competition. Again, I'm not saying if you're looking at a merger and you've got like a really clear innovation story as part of the data that are coming in, you of course want to take that into account. Don't throw information away. On the other hand, is there a presumption that innovation means we don't care about antitrust anymore or that we should kick it aside? I'm not so sure that's the case. Okay, a last point. This actually has to do with something I've learned about antitrust at the FCC, and we'll talk about it in that case. We'll bring up the FCC for this. I'm kind of old school when it comes to antitrust. Looking at me, as John has already pointed out, it'd be hard to imagine me being new school in virtually anything, given how long I've been around. And one of those old school ideas basically is that pure vertical integration is let's say presumptively benign outside regulated context. And the reason it's presumptively benign is the idea essentially that if someone's got market power, they can already exercise it, so the vertical integration stuff really doesn't, the second order effects really aren't predictably bad. Now, at the FCC, certainly, as I've sort of gotten back more into thinking about antitrust issues or other contexts, there's a lot of concern about vertical associations. Just to take something that happened before I got there, they imposed a lot of conditions on Comcast when it bought NBC Universal. Sorry, I'm already getting caught up in the acronyms. And so I was sort of, thinking about that. It's like, what memos did I miss and that sort of thing in terms of why these things get so much concern. And I think that there actually is a story, and it goes something like this, and it actually may be relevant even to headlines today. And the story is something like this. At the FCC, in a lot of the markets that it looks at, you've got people with very low, if not zero, marginal costs on both sides of the market. Say you've got program suppliers, marginal costs of additional, making the program available is essentially zero once it's produced. And you've got, say, people who retransmit programs or one way or the other, and those marginal costs on a per subscriber basis are actually quite low. I mean, the real costs, there may be licensing fees and stuff like that, but the real costs are very low. What that means is that in these transactions, unlike conventional economic markets, you actually have a gap in the value someone's willing to pay for something and how much it costs to produce something that's there, which leaves rents in economist jargon that get bargained for over. And what that means is that bargaining plays a much bigger role proportionally in matters that come before the FCC than they might otherwise. So I've had to learn a lot about bargaining theory lately. But one of the things about bargaining is that because things are set through bargaining, individual suppliers don't have the ability to set price and terms and conditions to allow them to extract all the market power they could have already, and that's what makes vertical integration at the margin relatively benign, because the blood's already being sucked out of the turnip. But if that's not already happening, then bargaining matters. Bargaining matters, and therefore vertical integration could matter. And it actually brings up one thing which I'll finish with, that's something that business-trained people, business school people understand, but has always been a mystery to me as an economist, which was, why does one merger beget another? That's not, standard economic theories have really got nothing to say about that. It's like, okay, these guys are going to merge. It's like, you say, well, let's say they're going to be more efficient. Well, if these two people were going to merge, and that would make them more efficient, they would have merged anyhow, right? What did this decision have to do with that decision? Or you get, perhaps again looking at the headlines today, you get a merger on one side of a market, people on the other side of the market decide they better merge. Those things are kind of hard to explain in standard economics, I think. But they may not be that hard to explain if you think prices are set by bargains. Because now, if these people merge, maybe they're going to get better bargains, which means these people are going to have to pay higher prices to make up for the fact that these people are getting lower ones. And they say, well, gee, I don't want them getting lower prices. We better merge so we can increase our bargaining leverage. And maybe, hey, if these guys are going to increase their bargaining leverage through an acquisition, maybe the people on the other side say, we'd better put ourselves in a position to increase bargaining leverage too. And that sort of thing could be responsible for a lot of stuff that's going on. So that's basically something that I've learned while I was there. So just some thoughts. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Tim, I think, has very graciously agreed to field a question.
Whether I can answer it doesn't matter.
Maybe one or two quick questions, and then we want to move to the panel. And if you could just simply identify yourself and then project your question, please.
We have a microphone.
Oh, okay.
For recording purposes.
Yeah, there's a question over here.
Thank you. Steve Molina with the federal government. Just a question. You had mentioned that the FCC...
Also in the witness protection program, apparently.
You had mentioned that the FCC doesn't have an economics bureau, and I was surprised to hear that. Is it maybe a recommendation of yours that they should?
I've been giving that kind of thing a lot of thought, and it's institutionally complicated. I think it's fair to say that if you ask virtually every chief economist before me, they think that one should. One of the things that makes me a little hesitant about that is that the FCC operates in a different legal environment and policy environment than the antitrust division of the FTC. To put it bluntly, somebody could come and run the antitrust division and come and run the FTC who thinks that economics is the worst set of ideas ever foisted upon humanity. But the point is, it doesn't matter, because if they want to win in court, they have to bring an economics case. It's just the way it's worked out. That's not pretty much the FCC's environment. I mean, this stuff gets, obviously everything they do gets appealed, but it doesn't get appealed on, they don't have to go before a trial court and make an economic case. They make, that shows up in varying degrees in the cases, in the orders that they issue and stuff. Everybody here can read those things and reach your own conclusions about that. But there's no outside authority that necessarily makes them toe the economic line. And I'm not sure that somebody should, because they've got a much broader public interest mandate. There's a lot of things that they have to worry about as well, to take into account, I personally think properly so. So if you take the economists and just sort of put them someplace outside everything else that's going on in the commission, I personally think that there's a Siberia risk. So, I mean, not necessarily the case. I don't want to say it's a firm prediction, but it's a risk. And so something about the system of having economists close to what's going on in the specific bureaus I think probably is a good idea. However, given that, there may be ways to improve the organization of those economists within those bureaus and stuff like that. And that gets into a little more detail than I probably would bore everybody with. But
Maybe one more question in the middle and back.
I'm Howard Buskirk with Communications Daily, and I wanted to ask, with the merger reviews that are coming up, the FCC has brought in a couple of economists to provide advice, as well as other outside talent. And can you explain what the logic is in bringing in outside help on things like this? Because you had some really interesting things to say about merger policy, for one thing.
to do a decent job on mergers takes a lot of people and a lot of expertise and a lot of experience. And those people, we on the legal or economic side can bring it. I think that's basically the story.
Okay, again, help me thank Tim. Okay, I think we'll turn straight away to the panel, which, as I mentioned, will be moderated by Carolyn Brandon. Carolyn is a senior industry and innovation fellow at the center, has been for several years, with a rich background in telecommunications and high technology, and so I'll just turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you very much again, Mr. Brennan, for joining us and allowing us to host you for your first public set of remarks. So we're just going to quickly run down, introduce folks by name and affiliation, and jump into the conversation. I think not only did we have a fulsome conversation teed up for you, but I think some of our remarks shared by Mr. Brennan has probably folded right into what I think we wanted to talk about today. So this is perfect. And not to engage you from the audience, but perhaps there might be some back and forth as we get started. So first we have Jim Kohlenberger, he's a former chief of staff for the White House OSTP back in the day, is an expert on all things high tech, whether it's mobile or wired. He is joined by Larry Downs, who's a noted author, is also the project director for the project on the evolution of innovation and regulation at Georgetown. Very happy to have him join us this year. Next to him is Tews, who is a contributor at AEI, formerly was head of government relations at Verisign, and is also a woman who knows cyber and high tech like no one else around town. And I was also very joyful that she was able to join, because it's not very often we have conversations on these issues, and there's actually 2 women on the dais. So thank you, Shane. And then, of course, last but not least, we've got our money man, Mike Rollins, who's head of research at Citi. He came down from New York to join us. And I think, Mike, before we get started, are there any disclosures that you need to share or point people's attention to?
Why, yes, there are. There are disclosures available at the registration desk if anyone would like them.
Alrighty, so the way we're going to roll this out is we're going to have a conversation. I would like to save some time for Q&A at the end. I often find it to be most interesting when the conversation is among the panelists as opposed to something stilted from the moderator, which is why I'm all the way over here. Focus should really be on the speakers. So, curtain raiser issue for all of you to react to, and we'll start with, let's start with Jim in terms of the order. So, the big picture question that we thought would be interesting is there something unique happening with technology innovation in the telecom and broadband sector that creates unique and significant pressures on the existing regulatory structures? Jim?
Great
And
question.
this cannot be a yes or no answer. by the way.
And if we all say no, then
Yeah,
we
I think
leave.
it's yes. No, but the internet has been the most destructive force in our generation, and I think as we look forward, I think that that it's going to be even more destructive. And if we think about it, right, there's really been, 3, I think, transformative, disruptive changes. First as we connected places like homes and businesses, then as we connected people with mobile devices, and now as we connect things, not just anything, but everything, and it helps drive this disruptive force. And if we think about the power of the internet so far, being able to create as much economic growth in the last 15 years as the industrial age did in 50, which is pretty phenomenal. Now the technologies coming down the line are going to be more transformative, the opportunities more pervasive, and the impact more profound. And if you look across the economy, what's amazing is that about 20% of the economy already has been transformed by digital technologies. We take a look at entertainment, take a look at finance, take a look at the IT and telecommunications sector, which has transformed all of these things. And that's a pretty phenomenal thing. But what it really means is that 80% of the economy has yet to be transformed by these new technologies. And as we look forward, right, 1% of the things that can be connected have been connected. And as we begin to connect everything around us, the things start happening. Tim talked about mail, right? And I like both my snail mail and my email. But if you think about the types of things that connected devices do, if we looked at FedEx, right, they're now thinking inside the box with little devices that track GPS location, temperature inside the box, can measure whether or not they're opened. UPS has fitted their trucks with all kinds of sensors so that they know in advance whether the engine is failing, how the driver is performing, if the packages are getting delivered. UPS estimates that just by doing this, if they can just save 1 minute per driver per day, it's a $14 million savings per year. That's pretty phenomenal. You start rolling that up through the economy in all sectors of the economy, and GE has taken a look at this in what they call the industrial internet. And if we can just boost productivity by just 1% across these sectors, which is about what the productivity improvement was in the late 80s that generated vast economic growth, then we get things that roll up into huge numbers, like $12 trillion for the entire global economy by 2030. That's like adding another U.S. economy to the global economy. So this has profound impacts. Things are coming ahead, but what does it mean for regulators? I think there's, 2 sets of primary issues. One, the pace of innovation is accelerating, and it becomes harder to keep up with, thus forcing new models. The interdependencies between players within technologies become more complex. thus looking for what the White House has called the multi-stakeholder process in terms of how we begin to look at these things. We tend to span more borders, both globally and across the country in terms of how technologies are developed, meaning more uniform types of approaches. And we're also leading to cross-boundary types of issues where, for example, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says that connected cars can save lives. FBI just said yesterday that they can cost lives. So we've got sectors, I think, that are now thinking about the same technologies in very different ways. What does it mean for policymakers? I think it means that we need to, there's opportunities to really seize upon this opportunity, coming down the pike and actually achieve massive benefits by, one, helping advance, networks to go faster and farther, helping tap into the talent and tenacity that we need to grow this thing, help crank up the innovation engine once again by, as Tim mentioned, kind of investments in the R&D that can help drive this forward. But I think it's also an opportunity for policymakers to think bigger, to think about how do we, help achieve the broader goals that we have, because I think these technologies, as they move into these other sectors, can help solve it for reducing energy, saving lives, lowering greenhouse gas emissions, for achieving, helping boost food production, but for helping achieve some pretty substantial goals down the road. And that's where the disruption is going to occur. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of it. I think we should be harnessing it.
I thought for sure you were going to mention improvements in beer delivery, but maybe that'll come
We'll
later.
come later.
Stay tuned for that. It's actually a good anecdote. Larry, thoughts on whether or not we're facing some unique issues and challenges in front of the regulating agencies? And for this purpose, we're really thinking about the FTC and the FCC. Obviously, there's a whole lot of other agencies out there that are thinking and impacting the tech and telecom sector, but for our purposes, we're focused really on any pressures that are being presented in terms of the FTC and FCC. Larry.
Sure, thank you. So I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm going to try not to repeat things I've been saying over the last 6 months in connection with the new book and the research behind it. But I have been involved in the last couple of years in conjunction with the Accenture Institute for High Performance in a research project looking at the impact of disruptive innovation, how it's changed, especially in the last 15 years, sort of when we first looked at it in the late 1990s. And, Mr. Brennan talked about sort of some of the exceptions to how that might impact the economy. But I think, let me talk for a second about the sort of non-exceptions, the sort of more general case. What we found is, again, not surprisingly, and as Jim said, is that the pace of disruptive innovation is accelerating. And rather than give you the examples I think I've worn out by now, I thought, well, let me just give you a short list of, from your own life, how you can see this in the last 10 years, just from the smartphone revolution, or even the, slightly more broadly, the internet revolution. If you think about what's disappeared or shrunk dramatically from the street that you would normally go down for your commercial activities. So here's a partial list of stores that are probably gone or are much reduced. Bookstores, camera stores, video rental stores, office supply stores, game stores, bank branches, electronics stores, post office branches, tax preparation offices. You probably see fewer, if not none, of those anymore, and that's all in really in the last 10 years, in some cases in the last 5 years. So I think that's just another way of thinking about how disruption is happening and how broadly it's happening. It's really, some of it's consumer products, some of it's professional services, some of it's big ticket items, some of it's small ticket items. It's really a very broad platform for disruption that we're seeing. And we'll talk about some of the specifics in a moment. I think about, where this affects the kind of regulation that is the provenance of both the FCC and the FTC. But I think my big observation, or my sort of big point, would be it's all about clock speeds. So again, as that disruption is not only is it very disruptive, but as Jim rightly points out, the pace is accelerating in many important ways. And not to say anything negative while in Washington about regulation and regulators, but I don't think anybody would argue that the pace of regulatory change, of legal change, either through courts or Congress or the regulatory agency, no one would argue that that is increasing at anywhere near the same pace. We might I think charitably say it's staying at the same pace. And by the way, often for very good reasons. We don't want governmental change to be haphazard or chaotic. We want it to be deliberate. That's the way we designed the system. It's worked very well. But here's the point where it doesn't work so well, is when you take sort of a regulatory process or a legal process that moves at a consistent pace, and you match it up against changing industries, changing consumer needs, changing products and service things that are changing at an accelerating pace, you are bound to get conflicts. You are bound to get what I sometimes refer to as accidents at the intersection of innovation and regulation. And I think that's the big challenge that faces the FCC, the FTC in this context, but as Carolyn mentioned, all the other agencies now, and as we move more to the Internet of Things, by the way, we'll hear a lot more about problems at the FAA and at the FDA and at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We're already starting to see more of the same kind of conflicts we've been seeing for a long time at the FCC and the FTC. We're going to see more of those, and more agencies will be involved.
And we want to spend some time drilling down on what those, as you call them, accidents are at the intersection. But first, Shane, from the tech perspective,
Right, so I follow cybersecurity and internet governance, and I've only been to the FCC twice, actually, my entire life. The first time is I was asked by a gentleman who is now running part of the cyber division, which they just recently opened, to come in and explain domain name addressing, because I used to be at VeriSign, and in the middle of the meeting, he goes, oh, by the way, you're going to have to file an ex parte on some open thing was going on, and I was like, no idea what you're talking about. I'm here because you asked me to come in and explain how the internet runs. So I have kind of a jaded feeling about it. But now they do have a cyber division, which fascinates me because I don't think they even have any jurisdiction over it. But watching the cyber area is so interesting from both a macro and a micro perspective, because we all have multiple devices that we're carrying around in our handbags, in our wallets, in our pockets, and every time they put, like when they put the iPhone out, I was at VeriSign at the time, and it was like it quadrupled how many devices were hitting the domain name addressing system within like a matter of an hour, and nobody called us and said, oh, by the way, we're going to quadruple your traffic within, so it's fascinating to be on the other side of it, which is, the commercial end and how the internet runs and how you just adapt. And then, part of the challenge with that became cyber attacks and denial of service attacks, or as they call them, DDoS attacks. And that, there's also that dark side element of it of, for all the good things it does for us, there's the challenges it brings to the table, and we're struggling with that as, with the U.S. government. How do we manage through that? There is not, as much as DHS would love to be the portal. I actually had somebody from DHS tell this to me. I'm sorry, it was a Senate staffer. He's like, well, you just have to send all the information to DHS, and then they're gonna, go through it, and then they're gonna tell somebody that something's bad. Like the whole conversation, I was just looking at him like, where do we start? What is the information that you're looking for? And depending on, who you are is what the value of the information is going to be. So actually getting to your question about, economists, I'm very fascinated with the whole big data element. There was another conference yesterday on internet governance, and they were talking about big data and how they should put the platform together on how the government can share information. And I thought, that's going to be fascinating, because I'm sure the people that want NOAA weather data are not the same people that care about things at NHTSA on whether or not telematics in cars are causing or creating capabilities on having accidents. So this is a really fascinating area, and I also have to say it's really fun to be at a group of lawyers, because I'm used to looking at people staring at their screens with blue coming off their face, because nobody actually looks at each other at a tech conference. So it's nice to see all your faces.
Michael, let me ask you a similar question, but slightly different, just given your perspective from the investment community. Any thoughts or commentary on this issue of the rapid increase in the pace of innovation and innovative change? Are you seeing that have impact within the sectors you're covering relative to either business models or the way in which these companies are trying to monetize, what they're doing for a living and or how they're competing with each other?
Sure. So, I think one of the more interesting aspects was described in one of these survey publications that Ericsson, the vendor, puts out. And this was from maybe a little over a year ago. And the interesting take that I had from, they're describing brand perception of different ecosystems. And the interesting thing is the best operating system, the best device, the best applications were all viewed more positively than the best network provider. And this is in mobile. And so if you just think about that for a second, and you think about the increasing use of devices, and you think about where customers are placing that incremental value, it creates an interesting challenge for the carriers. And that's what I focus on, because if the value is going to these other places, how do you keep growing the value for data consumption, let's say, right? So all the wireless, the wireless models to some degree have data consumption as a part of how they get paid. And, if you look at maybe in the whole industry, this year, Cisco VNI forecasts 25% data bit growth. I think it's a North American number, but we'll just sort of, condense that to a proxy for the US as well. Industry revenue growth for telecom carriers is roughly, by our numbers, around 2% this year. So think about that, right? You get a lot more volume growth than revenue growth. And that's not shocking, but the degree, I think, is interesting. And I think if you're a carrier, you got to try to figure out how you're going to get paid over time and grow that revenue base over time. And I call the theme running on a treadmill, in terms of trying to, carriers trying to figure out how to get paid more for consumption over time, versus sort of exerting a lot of energy and giving customers a lot more bits, but not getting very far because you're on that treadmill. So that's the way I think about it from a carrier perspective, and where customers are placing value over time.
So let's jump into a closer examination and discussion of some of these, as Larry, you said, and you can answer, maybe respond first if you'd like, these accidents, these intersections between technological innovation and the current regulatory strictures at the FTC and FCC. Examples of what you see as some of those issues?
Sure, and by the way, while we were talking, I was mentally going down Solano Avenue in Berkeley, which is near where I lived, and I have 3 more. Newsstands, currency exchanges, travel agents also have gone away on that street, so it's even a longer list. Yeah, I mean, so let me start, I guess, for the moment with the FCC. Obviously, the couple of really big collisions over the last 4 or 5 years have had to do with, on the one hand, with spectrum management policy, and these are very different, I think, so I'll say a little different about each of them. Spectrum management policy on the one hand, and what you might think of as sort of infrastructure governance writ large on the other hand, so, net neutrality, but really that's a small piece of a bigger conversation about the appropriate role for regulation of the infrastructure. Obviously, on the spectrum side, the problem really is one of clock speed. I don't know if I'm sure there are people who suggest, but I'm not suggesting that it's not appropriate role for the FCC to continue being the kind of, the main conduit for spectrum. But it's clear, and Chairman Wheeler has actually been quite eloquent about talking about, the spectrum map and how it's really a map that maybe made sense 100 years ago, but the way in which we do allocations and the way in which we do reallocations now that we've kind of run out of sort of frontier usable spectrum, clearly isn't keeping pace with the explosive, as Shane was talking about, and Mike, the explosive growth of mobile services on now and Internet of Things tomorrow. And that's a real dangerous intersection because we really need the FCC and the NTI, and we really sort of need a central clearinghouse to keep things in line. So that's one. And on the other side, of course, the entire debate about to what extent we need regulation of the infrastructure separate from any other piece of the internet ecosystem is obviously the other one. And you get a lot of, there's sort of, I mean, as with many political debates, there's a lot of misinformation on both sides and a lot of rhetoric that make it very difficult to have an intelligent, rational conversation. But I think, sort of the bottom line is it's a question of, was the model that was put into place for the old telephone monopoly essentially a utility model. Is that a model, its costs, do they sort of costs and benefits outweigh the other, or, is the model that has certainly been the dominant one since 1996, let's say, of essentially leaving internet access largely unregulated, which one has better cost benefit bottom line? That's the way the conversation should go. Generally speaking, it doesn't go that way, but it would be more helpful if it did.
Jim, any thoughts as to what you see as, important issues of the day at this juncture that are deserving of the regulators to be bold, be brave, think big?
I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and Larry, I think keeps, describing a serial killer on the loose of killing it, and I think we got to look at the other side of this. For every, according to McKinsey, for every one job eliminated, 2.4 jobs are generated. If we look at the apps economy, about 500,000 jobs, and I think of it more as a nursery of, and I'm sure he does as well. In terms of the types of things that are getting nurtured.
I'm often the babysitter, so.
But I do think that, at the FCC, I do think spectrum, it is the oxygen, it is the fuel for this future. We need to be thinking about that. By 2020, 20% of all devices on mobile networks will be machines talking to each other, and each one of these devices that are connected are using more and more bandwidth. If you look at this pen, which is a connected pen, can talk to my mobile device by Bluetooth. In the front of it is to be able to transcribe anything that I have into text. It's got a camera in the front end, an infrared camera that processes data at 70 frames per second, which is very, for
Are you
anybody who knows.
photographing the audience?
I'm photographing you guys. But that amount of data, as every sensor increases, the types of bandwidth that's going to get transmitted by every single device, this one transmits through my mobile device, then increases the bandwidth. And I think Larry's exactly right. Spectrum becomes more important. And I do think the FCC is doing some great stuff in terms of focusing attention on the upcoming incentive auctions and getting broadcasters engaged, which has to happen, the upcoming AWS-3 auction. But I also think that the one thing that policymakers have to do in this area, and importantly, I think NTIA is focused on this as well, is as we get to this Internet of Things, I keep hearing, in the transportation sector, we need our own spectrum for connected cars. In the smart grid, I hear the energy sector say we need our own spectrum for the smart grid. And I think we're not going to survive in that kind of future. And one of the things that policymakers need to be thinking about is how do we use existing networks, existing commercial networks, Wi-Fi networks to help enable these opportunities rather than using up scarce resources. At the FTC, I think there's some important conversations going on. I think it's great that they have both focused on the Internet of Things and on big data as big things coming down the road, because those are big things coming down the road. And I do think that FTC has a very important role for putting a spotlight on issues. But one of the things when I was in the Clinton White House, when we took a look at the pace of innovation that was accelerating in the early internet, we developed something that we called a digital Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And I think as we look at the explosion in the types of devices and innovations, things that are happening in big data, I think we can't imagine it all, and so we need to tread lightly as we go into this world in order to ease this opportunity. But the one thing, the other area the FTC has done well is, for example, early e-commerce, when they looked at the barriers that states had erected for wine, and in terms of the state barriers that prevented everybody from being able to take advantage of new wines. Or now, for example, on Tesla, again, a disruptor, the first American manufactured electric car, now being shut out of markets across the globe because of old rules that exist in states. I think these are right to shine a light on, and as disruption comes forward, I think there's an opportunity for them to look at those things to open markets.
So keying off of this issue of do no harm, and that's something that I think we've heard certainly coming out of the team and your colleagues in the Clinton administration. Maybe I can ask both Shane and Mike if you can offer a perspective, Shane, maybe from the tech perspective, and highlighting an issue that Larry ginned up, which is this open conversation right now relative to whether and how the FCC should be regulating broadband infrastructure. Is there something particularly concerning about applying what they know, they being the agency, i.e. a Title II sort of regime that was constructed for very particular purposes at a point in time with very specific technology capabilities, to what one would consider, one of mankind's most innovative creation, this internet of, the network of networks, this thing we call the internet. Any thoughts from the tech perspective? And then Mike, same concept, but any concerns within the investment community in terms of applying a public utility model to this infrastructure? Shane first.
Well, first, I just want to finish out the serial killer idea.
And
So
I missed the serial killer reference. What is that?
Mine is always, I call it the Ted Kaczynski point of view, which is that the FCC is, obsessed with broadband and everybody having access to broadband. And I'm like, really, do we think that Ted Kaczynski needed to get his Unabomber manifesto out that much faster? His problem was he was in a lean-to in Idaho. I mean, I'm pretty sure he was out in Idaho for a reason, so I'm always kind of fascinated with that element of it. And then the flip side of that is speed. And this was just, when I walked in here, I asked if there was a connection, if I needed a password, and the gentleman in the back who's helping us with the IT said, oh no, there's an open guest network, it's really slow. If you want speed, you need the password for the other network. And I thought, that's so rich, I just loved it. That's part of the challenge. And I also think we don't understand what the speed means, except for if I don't have it, I want it. And then I really don't understand the whole idea. To me, every time I hear the edge providers saying that, everybody needs the same thing, I'm like, why do you want everything to be slow? I mean, or slowed down? I mean, I think there's a misunderstanding about the need for the speed of the network, how it should be managed. Network management in general, I think, is completely misunderstood. Someone asked me last night if it was true that I could explain the internet on a cocktail napkin, and I said, I actually can explain ICANN on the back of a cocktail napkin. I could probably do the whole internet governance structure, but for the internet, I need a paper towel. But a lot of people just truly don't understand the layers of the network and the challenges. So I think part of the challenge that we're seeing right now with the open network order is that a lack of understanding. And John Oliver, God bless him, he's brought this to people's attention. But I think what would be great is if we could then kind of backfill that conversation with what does it mean? My mom sent me an email. She was very upset because she thought that, and full disclosure, I am a Comcast customer, happy one, that people were going to have access to her Comcast router if they were using Comcast, that you would be able to basically stay online all the time with your account, and I could move around. And I thought, that's awesome. And she was like, that's terrible. And I said, do you think your router knows special secrets about you? I mean, I just was fascinated how her mind went to, well, it knows and I'm like, it knows maybe the IP numbers of where you occasionally go, and I'm pretty sure it caches out pretty, efficiently. But, it's just a lack of understanding about what this whole, what people like to do on the internet. They know that speed's important, and they have this fear of not getting it, so therefore they want to have a discussion to slow the whole thing down. I think there's just a huge misunderstanding on the management of the network.
Mike, from the investment perspective.
Yeah, so I'd say some of the issues that I think the topical issues, and I don't think any of these are going to particularly surprise anybody, that are inputs into the way we think about things is first industry structure, and how regulators look at M&A. Second is going to be the spectrum policy. Third, and these are in no particular order, net neutrality and how much of the internet topology gets included into that conversation. And fourth would be special access. Fifth would be USF. And those are some of the things that, as decisions are made, it goes as inputs into how, people look at the opportunities, the business opportunities. And, as a sell-side equity analyst, it's my role to learn from all of you and learn from DC and the states where things are going, and then to help my clients understand what the implications of that are for their telecom investments. So that's how I spend my time. But those are the topical issues that I think that are certainly inputs into people's mosaic.
So I wanted to go back, Jim, to something you highlighted, which is, we are ever living in a global community, whether we, like it or not. And I guess the question is, we're not unique as a country in terms of grappling with spectrum policy, with broadband infrastructure, et cetera. Number one, is there a particular importance to the way in which Washington figures these things out relative to our global competitors, number one? And number two, are there any lessons to be learned in terms of how other countries are grappling with very similar issues?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think in the post-Snowden world, I think we look at the world and how it's reacting to the decisions we've made here, and I think we see a lot of challenges. Balkanization of the internet. Iran, Brazil, looking at different internets. The German president saying that we need internet independence from the rest of the world. Folks, trying to block what we're doing, and a lot of these things are in reaction to what we've done here. And I think it's a reminder that people are looking over our shoulder, and we need to be able to be. One of the things we need to be able to do is lead by example. And Shane mentioned cybersecurity, and I think this is one of those areas that's a global set of issues. And taking some of these lessons, this is one of these areas where in the administration and developing a voluntary cybersecurity framework, I think originally had gone down a path where they looked at legislative solutions or regulatory solutions, and again, cybersecurity, which travels in an attack vector changes in minutes, whereas a legislative cycle can take a decade. And challenges, if we lock in certain regulatory frameworks, it can leave us less agile and less able to respond. I think they looked at the fact that it's a multi-stakeholder thing. I think they took a look at adopting global industry best practices as the model. And so they came up with this voluntary cybersecurity framework. And I think this is more of a model in terms of how we need to go in the future are these types of innovative solutions. And again, this is something that crosses sectors. It's interesting to me that one regulator went to Verizon yesterday to visit them and then go make a policy speech. It wasn't the head of the FCC. It wasn't the head of the FTC. It was the head of the Treasury Department, and it was to talk about cybersecurity. And I think we have to remember that these are that there's a lot of regulators looking at these areas, and just in the U.S. And we need to have a more uniform set of solutions. And I think the cybersecurity framework is a great example, because what we do here does matter, and if we go too far, it'll hurt us. Recognizing that 97% of all customers of technology are beyond our borders, it can hurt us abroad.
So we've got cyber is an articulated issue of maybe this tension created by technology innovation and current regulatory policies and how we think about regulation. We have spectrum policy writ large, and there's lots of silos within that, and we have broadband infrastructure. What are each of your thoughts, and Michael, we'll start with you because not being within the policy family per se, maybe you have a different take on this. What are your thoughts on how one resolves or relieves the tension in a way that can, on one hand, maximize this economic thing we call consumer welfare, but at the same time balance with enhancing competition, driving innovation, and attracting private investment? Michael.
It's a good question. I don't know if I have a lot of answers on that. I think when it comes to spectrum policy, I think one of the topics that we see as an important area is as we look at usage profiles in the industry, we see a lot more traffic, for example, going down to the user than up back to the network. But what's interesting is if you look at spectrum, it's been largely auctioned or issued or licensed in symmetrical pairs, right? So here you have technology driving asymmetry of data traffic. And I think of wireless and spectrum as like a virtual highway, right? So if I'm driving into Manhattan in the morning, and if I'm crossing over the Tappan Zee Bridge, well, what happens? There's this divider that sits in the middle of Tappan Zee, and it moves, right? So if there's more traffic coming into Manhattan, you got more lanes going into the city, and the reverse on the way out. Because it's hard to change the flow of the way the spectrum is licensed, there's this bottleneck that's being created. And this is, the use of technology that's creating this bottleneck. And so, what we see over time, and we call this theme breaking symmetry, is that there's more value in the downlink because that's where the demand is. And these are the kinds of things that over time, we think are really interesting to focus on because, we think it's going to be a real issue that carriers are going to have to manage through. Now, to be fair, there are some solutions that they have technologically to start to deal with that. And I won't get into all the specifics of that here, but But depending on what that ratio of down versus up ends up being, it does create an issue. And that's where, when we look at what carriers, need to care about, this is an issue that's emerging, and it's all coming because of, the innovation of technology and the way that people are using all of these different connected devices.
Shane, any thoughts? I mean, are we looking at, we need to reform the underlying legislative frameworks that these agencies operate off of, or is it something else that's a little less of a big undertaking?
I think we're still working through where they can best step in to help. I mean, I think the challenge is, especially on cybersecurity, that we know we're going to have we have a continuing problem. It's huge. It's only going to get bigger. And how do we manage through this? As much as the best practices in the tech industry saying we'll take care of it ourselves, thanks, but no thanks, they just haven't stepped up to the plate at the level we need them to. And part of that is because you don't want to legislate in a particular type of hardware software application into the process. And so regulation doesn't really do well on regulating ideas, which is really what you're doing with the internet. It continues to morph. I mean, you go to the Apple store and they're like, we'll have a guy that does mobile who truly does not understand if you put a computer in front of him. I mean, that's just how vastly different they think. And I think Netflix was a really interesting way for people to learn, about local exchange carriers and what you need close to you, and taking it from an international perspective. When Putin got upset with Twitter about a month ago or a couple weeks ago, and he said, we want you to have servers within our country. We don't like the idea that all of our data is going back to the United States. I thought from a networking trafficking, I'd like them to have a local exchange server just so all that traffic doesn't have to come back to the United States, even though I think the NSA would still like it to keep coming here. But so I think there's lots of challenges of how we put this into context so it can be a solvable problem, because I think with the current regulatory framework and mindset, we can't solve the problem.
Larry, not that you've thought or written about the topic.
Well,
how do you
actually,
resolve this?
I want to say something about all three, but since I'm going to say something about all three, I'll do it really fast and short. So on Spectrum, I mean, obviously the thing that we have done incredibly right, it took a while, but the idea of auctioning, which Ronald Coase first proposed in 1959, which is the year I was born, that really has made a huge amount of difference. And I think the major change we now need is to improve the flexibility of the secondary markets. And one of the reasons why there's a lot of restrictions on the secondary markets of who you can sell it to and what use it can be put to, if you have a license you're not using, or you need you could share it, or you do something else. A lot of the restrictions on existing licenses are out of concern about interference. And increasingly, I think the technology is better able to avoid or resolve the interference than we have given it credit for up till now. So I think as the interference technology gets better, it will be easier to make the secondary markets more flexible. Hopefully that's what we'll do. So that's Spectrum. On cybersecurity, yeah, I recognize the real problem. I think but it's also worth noting for a lot of countries that have not had our success in the internet ecosystem and taking full advantage of it, this is a very convenient excuse for limiting the impact or limiting the penetration of US-based companies at the, it's just basically, it's a lot of protectionism that's now in the guise of security and so on. And I think, so in that context, it's worth saying, well, why has the US been so much more quick to develop businesses and business models on these new platforms than most, if not every other country? And I think one key one to highlight is essentially the First Amendment, which my friend John Perry Barlow famously said, in cyberspace, the First Amendment is a local ordinance. We have it baked in, literally, into the Constitution, and that has meant a much more open approach to how we think about information flow. To get particular for a second, that's reflected, I think, very much in a very important provision of the Communication Act, which is Section 230, which protects website operators, internet service providers, pretty much everybody from third-party liability for what people might say through your channel or on your website or on your blog. You cannot imagine companies like Facebook, Twitter, anything, Reddit, anything having to do with social media coming into existence without that kind of protection. And indeed, in countries that don't have it, you don't have companies like Facebook and Reddit and Twitter. So I think that's been a really important guidepost for us that is much bigger than we give it credit for. On the broadband infrastructure, yeah, it's not going to be any surprise. My position is steady as she goes. I mean, leaving it largely unregulated as we have. We've had, over the last 15 years, $1.2 trillion in private capital invested in several now generations of new infrastructure, and we haven't by any means stopped there. And of course, no one is suggesting that it's a perfect market, or even such a thing as a perfect market exists, but certainly it's done, the market, if there is such a thing, has done a pretty good, if not excellent job of resolving the kinds of issues that do come up, things like, peering and transit and so on. That's worked very well. It's hard to imagine a kind of a command and control, or even a case-by-case regulatory review process with an agency, any agency in the middle of that kind of resolution process, doing a better job, a faster job, a cheaper job, whatever metric you want to use for better. So leave that one alone.
Jim, a fix.
A fix. I do think though that so I think these are the right sets of issues, and to be focused on. But I think we need to, as the smart revolution moves from the palm of our hands to our smart watches, our smart cars, our smart homes, our smart buildings, our smart pens, our smart cities, I think we need smart policy to go with it. And I think that's, taking a look at these things and looking for the opportunity that we can get out of it. And I think, to me, that's the macro sense. We've got a lot of policy issues that are going to be out there, and I think what we need policymakers not to help throttle this disruption or revolution going forward, but to help pave the way and open up the floodgates of opportunities that can come down the road.
All right, so we are at 11:25. Technically, we're supposed to be done at 11:30. We might not get booted out since it's our building. However, wanted to quickly turn it over to see if there were any questions or even reactions to any of the commentary. Okay, down here in front. And do we need the microphone for taping purposes? Because I think people can hear. Okay.
Hi, Daniel Berninger. I've been thinking about how to speed the IP transition and make sure it's HD voice. But as I get into it, I get more and more concerned that we're going to end up sleepwalking into a federal computer commission. And, the title of the topic today could be that, are we sleepwalking into a federal computer commission? So for the panel, are you worried about that as well, or, how do you avoid that?
You've stunned them into silence.
Let me jump in. First off, big kudos to Dan. Dan has been a passionate leader in the IP transition, not just in the last few years when FCC opened this item, but back when he helped found the Voice on the Net Coalition and helped found Vonage and others and helped really spur this revolution. I think your work on HD Voice, I think, is really important because it's a reminder that as we move to this future world, even with voice, we forget that the telephone network was designed originally in this analog world with just a few frequencies in mind, because that was what we could hear. And now when we open it up, all kinds of things are possible. I do think there's times in the past where I've been worried about FCC becoming a federal computer commission. I do think that Chairman Wheeler is someone who came out of the venture capital community, as someone who has done a lot of startups. I think he is, very focused on innovation and helping, advance the future. I don't worry about that as much. I worry about that in other areas of the government where I don't see the same kind of forward-looking approaches.
Shane or Larry, any thoughts?
Well, I think the IP transition is another one we could have easily added to the list of collision points, and it certainly, I think, it's fair to say, got off to a slow start. Now I think it's at least heading in the right direction. I would actually like to see it move faster, and I think just sort of getting some of the lessons from what worked and what didn't work in the digital television transition, which is fairly close analog. To me, what would really help is the setting of a date certain for when it will turn over. and sticking to, and again, lesson from the DTV, sticking to that date. Not a lot of people get excited when I say that, but I still think that that's an important way to advance this and accelerate it in a helpful way, because it's, right now, I mean, it's just costing a wasted amount of money to maintain these two networks, one which has clearly had its moment and one which is clearly the future. It would be great to get it off and over as quickly as possible.
Another question over here?
Hi, Nathan Miller, I'm on faculty at the McDonough Business School. When I think about the high-tech industries that we've been talking about as an economist, I think kind of what makes them distinct to me is that they kind of have three characteristics. One is that in many of these industries there's economies of scale. As firms get bigger, they can leverage fixed costs over more customers. There are network effects, Facebook or Uber, by connecting people, and the value of the product increases with the number of people that use it. And the third is that the markets are getting larger. We're moving from local markets to national markets or worldwide markets. And I think that those three things are interesting because the first two are forces that tend to make markets more concentrated. They move markets towards monopoly conditions, whereas the latter force, bigger markets, allows for more firms to operate. And so my question is can we rely on competition? How much can we rely on competition going forward to allow the value that's created in high tech to be broadly shared?
So it's almost the inverse of what Mr. Brennan was talking about, which is innovation might not be the sole silver bullet to solve all of the issues. So on the flip side is competition.
There's a crossover effect. Like, think about Uber. You know, people, once you get used to the idea that you can dial something up, it's got your credit card. You have this seamless thing where this car shows up and you don't have to give them any money and then they go away. And now people are using that as a model in multiple areas. I think about showrooming and how people were upset, the retailers were upset because they said, you go in and you look at things and then you leave and you order it on your phone. Candidly, the reason why I ordered it on the phone is that it takes so damn long to check out now at a retail. You're so used to the speed of things happening that standing there and dealing with the human factor of some woman wandering around and then trying to upsell me on something's frustrating. So I think that it's been really unique to see how it has crossed over certain industries. It starts out with open table and then it moves to other things that realize that the efficiency means everybody makes more money. And I think about the realtors. They didn't want people to have the MLS listings. And I was like, do you like driving around in your car? Why, if I know exactly what I want and I can go look it up and I can just do the final thing by doing the walkthrough and be like, yep, that's it. There's just so much more that can get accomplished. And I think that the economics on that, if you watch it closely, you've probably seen it, but there's certainly a lot more data that can be shared around that.
Please, Jim.
Well, I would just, so I'll go back to the research project for a moment. So the short answer is yes, I think we can rely, in fact, we can rely more on competition than we did before for a couple of reasons. One of which is what our research showed was that in a growing range of industries, pretty much every industry we could think of experienced this to some extent. The sort of the traditional diffusion of technology process was getting shorter and more steep. And that meant that even companies that got dominance, even the companies that had monopoly power, had it for a much shorter period of time and didn't have as much opportunity to exploit it as they used to. Again, it's not every market, but it's certainly in any high-tech related market, and it's moving into non-high-tech related markets because of the diffusion of high-tech by and large. The second thing that's happening, this is what Shane was referring to, is consumers are getting more leverage. Because of the mobile revolution and because of social media, consumers who used to need a regulator often to speak with one voice and to get sort of a balance with providers, on the other hand, now have much more ability to do it themselves through reviews, through social sharing. There's this great, I keep coming back to this great set of commercials HTC is now doing with, who's the actor? Anyways, the HTC One, and the actor says, I'm not going to bother telling you all the great features of this new phone because people who buy our phones do all their research by asking other people on the internet anyway. So I'm just going to sit here while you go check the internet. And then he does, he just sits there. And that's, you know, that's obviously an exaggeration, but more of that is happening. And I think that becomes a counterbalance to anti-competitive or potentially anti-competitive behavior.
I think for competition purposes, you know, oftentimes we find challenges in defining the market. What is the market that they compete in? You know, so you look at Uber. Is Uber a taxi service or is it a mobile app? You know, what exactly is it? And once you start taking a look at some of these things and trying to fit new technologies in old boxes, when companies are trying to think outside of the box, I think sometimes it's a challenge. And I take a look at, you know, Carolyn mentioned at the beginning about beer delivery. You know, one of the things I think, you know, these guys this last winter in the middle of the polar vortex out on the Great Lakes came up with a wonderful mobile app. And this was, you know, with your GPS coordinates, you could order a 6-pack of beer, a drone would come over and drop off that beer. But because that drone met the definition of a, you know, commercial aviation system, FAA shut it down. And I think, to me, when I look at it, I think we need to make sure that, you know, the old definitions of things aren't forestalling new opportunities. Or if you take a look at Tesla again, I like Tesla. They're, I think, very innovative. They've got a car that runs on software. Rather than rear view mirrors, they found that with video cameras and video recognition technologies, they can actually provide a safer world where they can actually highlight things on a screen that are coming at you and give you more information and provide a safer alternative than the rear view mirror. But a car is defined as a rear view mirror. And so I think part of the issue that regulators have is old static definitions that don't meet the future well, and so how do we come up with more innovative, flexible definitions for what the future could hold?
Or at least not without revisiting the cost benefit that went into the original decision to have a rule. If you've got a new circumstance, rather than, as you say, reflexively applying the old rule, and also not reflexively not applying the old rule, but if you're going to think about it in the original context. Why did we do this? Is that cost benefit equation changed? And does that suggest a new rule, use the old rule, or no rule at all?
So we are at our witching hour of 11:35. I just want to say thank you very much to our panelists for joining us. And I also want to do a shout out. I think the center and the project is going to go into hibernation for the month of August. But please stay tuned. We're going to have kind of a cool event in September with some really interesting speakers in partnership with Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. And again, it's to take a big picture perspective, not just on tech telecom, but a couple of other sectors within the economy, and think about how technology is driving some choices and some regulatory dilemmas there. So thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers very much.